Okay, for this lecture, let me zoom in. For this lecture, we're going to look at GDP and production. So to give you a basic overview of the macroeconomy, or how much we produce as a nation, here's a graph of US GDP, which we're going to see is a measure of total production in the US. So this is a graph. It's using quarterly data since 1949. So we see January 1949 all the way up to the second quarter, so first quarter 1949 through 2012 or so. Okay, so if we look at this, we see a number of things. Okay, first off, what is GDP? What do we use it for? Well, GDP is a measure of production, but it also measures much more than that. GDP also measures, it's a measure of standard of living. Okay, so for example, if a nation produces apples, and that's the only thing that they produce, well, what's the only jobs that are available? Well, it's going to be picking apples. So how does that money get made? Well, the only money that's going to be made is from people picking apples or producing apples. And then whatever money is sold goes back to the workers as a form of income. So that income measure is going to be a standard of living measure. The more money you make, the better off you are. So here, if we look at production, the only reason that there's income is because we produce. So in this example, GDP is a measure of standard of living. Okay? The second way that we use GDP is to look at economic growth. It measures how fast economies grow. And what that means is, looking at the US, from 1949 until 2012, what we've seen is that production in the US has increased. So this line is upward sloping. In fact, even at the worst part of the recession in 2009, so this low point right here, right? We were better off, or we were producing more at that lowest point than we were in 2000, which is right here. So even at the worst part, we were producing more than we did 9 years earlier. And in 2000, we were producing more than we did in 1991, 9 years earlier. And in 1991, we were producing more than we did in 1982, 1983, and so forth. This line has been upward sloping. So GDP is going to measure how fast economies grow. Not only do we look at economic growth, but we want to look at increases in the standard of living. Okay, so if it's a measure of standard of living, this growth tells us how fast that standard of living is growing as well. Okay, so a good example of this might be if we're looking at two economies, so we'll look at China and Japan. And if we look at China and Japan, they roughly have the same GDP. Okay, so if we're looking at GDP, China and Japan produce approximately the same amount of goods and services, okay, in a year. However, what do you know about China and Japan? Well, we know, number one, that China has a much larger population. So that measure of income, or that measure of standard of living, has to be distributed more in China than it does in Japan. Okay, so that would mean that on average for each individual, Japanese individuals make more money or have a higher income and therefore a higher standard of living than China. So the question is how fast does China grow and how fast does that standard of living grow? Is China ever going to catch up to Japan in terms of standard of living? On a gross scale, not looking at the populations, they're equal. However, we want to know, is China going to catch Japan in per capita terms or in standard of living terms? So standard of living is usually looking at GDP per capita. And when we look at economic growth, we're trying to measure that standard of living. And we're going to have another lecture based entirely on economic growth. So if I'm glossing over this, that's okay. Okay, so number one, GDP measures standard of living. Number two, we use it for our economic growth measures. So how fast did the US grow between 1949 and 2010? So this is measuring where our economy is headed, or where it's been in the past, and where it's going to continue to go in the future. That's an important question. And then lastly, we use GDP to tell us about business cycles. And what do we mean about business cycles? Well, business cycles are going to be the ups and down fluctuations of GDP. So here I have a graph since 1960 of US GDP, which is the blue line. So that blue line is identical to the black line on the earlier graph. Okay? And here we have a measure of some sort of potential GDP. So this is what we could produce. And if we look, overall, we see that there's some instances in time where GDP is above potential. So the blue line is above the red line. So what we're actually producing is above what we potentially could produce, our potential GDP. But we also see instances where GDP is below our potential. And we call this the business cycle. So GDP tends to fluctuate up and down around potential. And we want to understand what that is. When it's below potential, we call that a recession. When it's above potential or growing, we call that an expansion. So we use GDP to understand expansions and recessions. All right, let me get out of here. And we're going to look at what is GDP. Okay, well, what we basically want to do is we want to measure the macroeconomy. So when we want to measure the macroeconomy. When we wanted to measure the market for oranges, we could use a supply and demand graph, and that tells us equilibrium quantity of oranges produced and sold. However, we want to measure the US as a whole. So how much is the US producing in a year? How productive is the US? How much income does the US make? That's a macroeconomic issue. So we want some sort of measure of that macroeconomy, or measure of production. Okay? So GDP is a measure of production. Right? And here we want to measure production. Okay? Well, we face a problem, because if the US produces DVDs and oranges, suppose it produces 20,000 DVDs, or I guess Blu-rays now, and then it produces, we'll say, 15,000 bushels of corn. And then lastly, it produces 3,000 automobiles. So we're looking at this and we go, 20,000, 15,000, and 3,000. But we want to know how much did the US produce overall. So first off, this is in each individuals. We produced 20,000 individual DVDs and 3,000 individual automobiles. But our corn measurement is in bushels. It's not individuals. So we have different units. So we just can't add. And then secondly, we run into the problem is if we add DVDs and automobiles, even though they're in the same unit, we get 23,000. But 23,000 what? Okay, so our problem is when we're measuring production, we can't add the quantities across. So even if we found a standard unit, each or in bushels, or however we wanted to measure it, we just can't add straight across. So what we do to get around this is we say, well, how much value did we produce in DVDs? How much value did we produce in corn? How much value did we produce in automobiles? And if we take value, since it's in dollars, we can add value in dollars plus dollars plus dollars. So GDP is converting what we've produced into the value of what we've produced. and we add all those values together to get a meaningful measure of how much did we produce as a whole. Okay, so GDP is defined as, so GDP, it's actually called gross domestic product. We have two acronyms for it. We call it GDP, or we also call it capital Y. So if I use capital Y, that refers to GDP, or if I just say GDP, that's gross domestic product as well. Okay? And GDP is defined as the value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Okay, so a couple of key words here. We're looking at the value, and we have final goods and services, and it's produced in a country. So if it wasn't produced in the US, it's not going to be counted as part of US GDP. Okay? So, for example, how would we calculate the value or the GDP of this economy? Well, what's the value of a DVD? Well, isn't that equivalent to the price? So if we know that we produced 20,000 DVDs, and let's just say that they were $10 each, and corn, we have 15,000 bushels of corn, and let's just say that each bushel cost $1. I don't know how much corn costs. And then we have 3,000 automobiles, and each automobile cost $10,000. Or we'll just call it 1,000, excuse me. Okay? Or this is per bushel. Okay? So we have the value of each unit, and then we can multiply the quantity times the price, and that gives us the value of total production. So here, 20,000 times 10 gives us $200,000 worth of value that we produced in DVDs. So the value equals quantity times the price, and that equals 20,000 times 10, which is $200,000. So here the US produced $20,000 of value in DVDs. We add this together. 1 times 15 gives us that the US produced $15,000 of value in corn. And then lastly, 1,000 times 3,000 tells us that the US produced $3 million in value in automobiles. Okay, so automobiles are obviously more valuable than a DVD, and the price reflects that. So even though we produce less automobiles, because they're worth more, we've actually produced more value in automobiles than we did in DVDs. Okay, so if we add this together, the total GDP is going to be equal to 200,000 plus 15,000 plus 3,000, or 3 million, excuse me. So that's going to be equal to 3,200,000 or $215,000 in value. So overall, the US would have produced $3,215,000 of stuff in this year. And that's giving us a measure of how much we've produced, but it's also giving us a measure of our income. Okay? So overall, total income in the US was about $3,215,000. All right. So next, we want to look at how is GDP computed. Okay. So there's a few ways that we count GDP. Okay. So first, we're using market values. So we take the price, and then we have the quantity of it. Okay. So there's a few different ways to measure GDP. Number one, we can take everything that we produced and add it up. Number two, we can take what we sold, because what we sold is going to be approximately equal to what we produced. Okay, so supply equals demand, which means that we have market clearance, so what we produced equals everything that's sold. So if we take our national income, that's going to give us a measure of production as well. So we take the value of everything that we sold, and that's going to be a measure of income, so it's how much revenue firms are making. But that's also going to be a measure of production. So if Apple sells an iMac at $1,500, it's taking in $1,500 of income, right? But that means that it's produced $1,500 of value because that's the price of one iMac. Okay, so we can look at adding up incomes or looking at tax statements, and that will give us a meaningful measure of GDP or production as well. And then lastly, we can look at value-added approach. And the value-added approach says instead of looking at the final goods and services, such as the iMac to the consumer, we want to look at how much value is added at each stage of the game. Okay, so for example, let me erase this. We obviously don't want to double count. Okay, and the problem when we look at value added or final goods and services, we can't use both. Okay, so for example, we don't want to count intermediate goods or something that's included in the price of the final good. Okay, so a good example of this is when I go to buy a new car, right? Should I count the price of the car plus the value of the tires that are on the car? Well, if I add the value of the tires on the car plus the value of the car itself, aren't I double counting the tires? Because when I buy a new car, I damn well expect there to be tires on that car when I buy it. So if I go to the BMW dealership and pay for a BMW, part of that money is being paid for those tires. So the value of the BMW, the final good, includes the value of the intermediate good, the tires on there. Okay? So if we count intermediate goods plus the final good, we're double counting those. Okay? So overall, we want to include only final goods, or we can count intermediate goods and add those up separately, and that should equal the value of the final good. Okay? So to give you an example of this, suppose we're looking at cell phone production. So we're looking at cell phones. Okay, so what are some steps involved in producing cell phones? Well, number one, we have to assemble the outer case. The second step is to prepare the internal hardware, so getting the computer chip ready. Step three is we have to install the software, so getting the operating system on there. Fourth step is connect it to a network. So we have to make sure our cell phone communicates with Verizon or AT&T or Virgin Mobile. And then step five is we sell it off to the retail. So the retail seller sells it. So Verizon or AT&T would sell their phone. So each step of this game, so how much did that outer assembly cost, right? So if we take the value of the raw materials minus the assembly of the outer case, what we sold the outer case as, that would be the value added. So the value added is, for the outer case, let's say it's $5. We can buy the outer case for $5. So the value added from the raw materials to produce the case, which is already pre-molded, is $5. So we added $5 in value to the cell phone simply by producing the outer case. If we prepare the internal software, or the hardware, that adds $10 of value. So if we take the outer case and put it in a computer chip, that whole thing is worth $5 plus $10 or $15. Okay? But overall, we've added $10 of value by adding the hardware. Installing the operating system is $15. So operating system costs $15. So if we add this to the $15 there, we're up to $30 total. Okay, so we sell the internal hardware and the outer case for $15. We add $15 for operating system. We're at $30 total. Then we connect to the network, and it costs $49. So to get Verizon to talk to our cell phone costs $49. And then lastly, we have to pay to ship these. So they ship from wherever they're produced to our retail center. And then we have a customer service agent working there, and he sells you. So he's going to show you the phones, and then he's going to proceed with the transaction. And the value added there is $120. Okay? So look at what happens if we add up. So the price at each step. So here, assembling the outer case, we can buy that for $5. We can buy the outer case plus the internal hardware for $5 plus $10, which is $15. We can buy the outer case, the hardware, and the operating system for $15 plus $15, which is $30. Next, we can have an entire cell phone that connects to the network for $30 plus $49, which is $79. And then the final cost of the cell phone is going to be $199. Okay? So if we look at the price of the product at each step along the game, we're double counting. Because if we take this, the transaction to the consumer, plus the assembly of the outer case, we've already added that in. Okay, so if we take the total of all of this, 5 plus 15 plus 30 plus 79 plus 199 gets us to 338. So here we've double counted. This 338 includes the price of the case here, plus the price of the case here, plus the price of the case here, plus the price of the case there. But if we take the value added at each step, that gets us to $199. This is the price of the final good. So what we can do when calculating GDP is we can calculate all final goods and services produced. So the cell phone to the consumer costs $199. Okay, so if we take 10 cell phones sold at $199 each, that means that we produced $1,990 in value of cell phones. Or what we can do is we can take the value added at each step. So if we produced 10 outer cases and we added $5 in value to that outer case, that would be $50. 10 internal hardware, so 10 computer chips plus the assembly case, gets us to 10 times 10, which is $100 in value added by producing the internal software. And so if we took all of that, it would equal the value of the final good and service. So what we can do is we can take final goods or services, or we can take the value added at each step. But what we can't do is we can't add 199 plus the value added. That would get us to 338. Okay, and obviously that means that we've double counted. So we need to avoid double counting. Lastly, if we look at final goods and services, if we look at an iPhone, iPhones say made in China. Okay, so, well, that would mean that for China, $199 goes to their GDP if we use the final good approach. However, if we look at the value added method, the assembly of the outer case happens in China. The internal hardware, we'll say, is prepared in Taiwan. Operating system is made in the US. It's connected to the network in the US. And we sell it in the US to you. So we can get a much more better measure in a global economy where an iPhone is actually made in 49 different countries, or it takes 49 countries to come together to make one iPhone. If we take the final good, we say that it's made in China. However, if we look at the value added, Taiwan and the US each add value to that iPhone. So to get a better measure of GDP, instead of taking final goods and services, what we would do is find how much value added did we produce in iPhones as a nation. Well, we didn't assemble that outer case, so we shouldn't count that as part of our GDP. We didn't prepare the internal hardware, so that can't be counted as US GDP. But Taiwan can claim it as their production because that's something that they contributed. The US installed the operating system, connected to the network, and sold it to you. So overall, the US could claim that we made 15 plus 49 plus $120 of value in each iPhone. So if we take the value added approach, how much value we added of each iPhone times the number of iPhones that were sold, that will get us how much value we produced total for iPhones as a nation. Okay, which is going to be different where iPhones wouldn't count if we're using final goods because it says made in China. So in a global economy, economists are very wary of using final good approaches to calculate GDP, and we prefer to use the value added method. All right. And with that, that should get you everything that you need to know about what is GDP, what is it used to measure, so why do we look at GDP, and then how do we measure it. So I've given you a couple different ways to measure GDP.